I want to give a big thank you to all my patrons, and I'll be doing a Kingsguard roll call after today's video. Welcome back to the Fantasy Network, everyone. My name is, of course, Jimmy Nuts, and today we're going to be talking about The Black Company by Glen Cook. Not the entire overarching series that has almost 10 or more books, I believe, but just book one in this epic fantasy, dark fantasy, military fantasy series. This book came out in May of 1984 and has a long history and a lot of influence in the things that we see in modern fantasy today. I did mention the fact that it is dark fantasy, and I have noticed that authors who have become, spearheads for dark fantasy in the modern age have oftentimes pointed back to Glen Cook as being an inspiration and doing something vastly different than what was going on in the genre in the 80s and before. Those likes are Stephen Erickson, Joe Abercrombie, and many others. So I wanted to read this series mainly out of curiosity. I wanted to see what it had for me and maybe take a look back into the 80s and see what was developing that has influenced what we read today in the fantasy genre. Also, Alan from the Library of Alexandria has recommended this to me personally, along with Stephen Erickson, who wrote Malazan, and he said that this series had a lot of influence on him whenever it came to the Marines, which is some of my favorite parts of the Malazan series. However, the one weird thing that I have found with The Black Company by Glen Cook is that it seems that a bunch of people who read Malazan or Joe Abercrombie or any other dark fantasy, they try to go down this path as well, and I have seen mixed results, to say the least. Many people consider the first book of the Black Company series, The Black Company, to be the weakest, at least from what I've seen here online. So let's talk about what I loved about the book, some of the common criticisms that I have seen online, and also I guess I should probably tell you what the series/book is about, right? The Dominator is an extremely powerful wizard who has the ability to turn his most bitter enemies into his loyal servants, even those nearly equal in magic. The most potent of his victims are called the 10 who were taken, or just the Taken for short. With his wife, the Lady, whose magical skill is second only to that of the Dominator, he founded an empire unrivaled for evil. It was overthrown by a rebellion led by the White Rose, but neither she nor the rebel wizards were strong enough to kill the Dominator, the Lady, or the Taken. The best they could do was to render them unconscious and imprison them. Their prison was a place called the Barrowland. Now, after about 400 years, we end up having a wizard or a magician going in and talking to the Lady, trying to learn from the Lady to harness more power. He ends up being tricked, taken over by the Lady, and then the Lady rises out of the Barrowland and starts bringing back the 10 who were taken. However, she does not bring back the one person who was more powerful than she, the Dominator. She has left the Dominator to rot, essentially, in the Barrowland, and that is kind of where Black Company starts off. There are people obviously coming together in a rebellion, just like they did with the White Rose, and we find ourselves smack dab in the middle of this conflict and of all of this craziness, lots of magic, lots of wizards, with a mercenary band of elite soldiers. So this is very much high fantasy, but the one thing that it does is it kind of peels back the layers of a lot of the high fantasy stuff that I'm mentioning here that is the world building that I think is quite neat. And then gives you the perspective of the grunts on the ground. This mercenary band is simply just trying to make their way through this conflict and get paid. And they don't always find themselves on the right side of the battle. And I thought that that was a really amazing thing. And even though we've seen this done a lot in the modern fantasy genre, back in the 80s, maybe it wasn't happening so often or really ever. This might have been the first time we ever really got to the boots on the ground level things where not every single character has an amazing trait that makes them a chosen one or anything. So when you peel those layers back and you get lower to the ground, you get really relatable, flawed characters. And that's where a lot of the dark fantasy stuff comes from. The gray characters, as everyone likes to talk about. Glen Cook does this not just in a way that's impressive for his time, but for me, I found these characters to be awesome. This is a chronicling of the tales, and throughout the books there are different chroniclers from what I've been told, but this one here is actually being told from the healer's perspective. Croker's a lot more than just a healer. I mean, he's a doctor for the company. He is handling some of the most grotesque injuries, all the while also being the historian for the company. So we get this really interesting thing that, at least through this first book, we're with Croker, and he has a way of describing these events that are actually completely unique to his perspective. And one of the things that I've been told that's a strength as this series goes on is that there are different chroniclers that are not Croker, and you'll be able to tell who's the one telling you the history without even hearing the name because of the way that it is written, which shows that Glen Cook takes special care when considering the way that he's doing this like framed chronicling, and also from what perspective it is. So that's strong character writing. That's a strong narrative. I like that a lot in a story. And where I was seeing a lot of crossover with Malazan, if you happen to be a Malazan fan, and even if you're not, is the fact that the names do remain very simple, but can have some different meanings, right? So we have Croker, we have the captain, the lieutenant, Silent, Goblin, which I really, really like, Tom Tom, Brother One Eye, Elmo is also a sergeant in the company, and the list goes on and on and on. And the naming conventions do remind me a lot of Malazan, and I think that they add a little bit to the personalities of these characters in this band of, I don't want to call them misfits because they actually work really well together, but they do bicker and they have conversations about petty things, and they have feuds and whatnot, and there's some people that don't fit in. Like, we don't really trust this guy Raven. What's up with Raven? He's a leaner. He's a little bit of an edgelord. So there's a lot of personalities here. There is some bit of distance from the perspective, and this is where I see a lot of people. One of the big criticisms I see is that the characters, they just couldn't get with the characters. But I think if you're familiar with more of a distance POV from something like Malazan, for instance, I think that you could be comfortable here, and I find it fun to fill in the blanks and also recognize that this is being told to me by somebody, like someone is telling you the story. So I happen to enjoy the characters quite a bit, and I think that there's a good range of characters within the Black Company in this first book. So even though these soldiers are in this high fantasy world, they're very relatable, very human, down to the nitty gritty of who these people are and what's happening, in a much more intimate, personal level than many of the other fantasy of its time. And, still today, I see a lot of that. And I think that Glen Cook has a place in no matter what era that he can write strong characters. And one of the things that Cook does really, really well. Calling him Cook sounds weird. It sounds like a Black Company name. Glen Cook does really well is that he shows more than he tells. He is definitely a shower, not a teller. And I think that is a good way of describing Black Company in general, because sometimes it can feel a little sporadic. But whenever a character is supposed to be sly or cunning or a badass or whatever it might be, you don't have to just take his word for it. He's actually going to show you those examples within the story. And there is a scene with Raven, and this really isn't a spoiler, but essentially they end up killing what is kind of like an outlook or a spy. And before they go, they say, hey, Raven says, hey, we must burn his feet. He tells the captain, burn this dead body's feet. And they're all like, what? Why? And he's like, that way it looks like we interrogated them, because they're kind of doing, they're moving with knowledge that the enemy doesn't know that they have, right? So they actually have a lot more intel than the enemy would ever know. So if they were just to leave the dead body there, it'd be like, whoa, how did they know this lookout was here? They must know something. But instead, Raven burns the bottom of this dead body's feet to say, oh, that's how they got the intel. That's how they knew all this extra information, is that they tortured him. And that is a really amazing way of showing me that Raven is cunning and highly intelligent and dangerous in all accounts, rather than just saying Raven was super cunning and so sly and blah, 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 like I see in a lot of fantasy novels. So I like that fact. And it's a very effective way of also moving the plot along without taking a break to do some exposition or have someone belch out some ugly dialogue about, well, Raven is so sly and cunning. He showed me, and it advanced the plot, and it took 2 sentences. And for me, that is way more efficient than just like an exposition info dump. So as far as the criticism of the characters goes, I find myself on the opposite end of some of the common criticisms that I see for Black Company with the characters. I think I've laid out what I like about them and some good examples. But another thing that you will hear is that the writing is very tense and terse and short and brief. And that is true. They are short, choppy sentences, and they're certainly nowhere as abrupt as I was expecting whenever you read online, people bouncing off of this series. And I can understand why some people would not like the short, choppy sentences. I've heard people say that Glen Cook hates commas. If it should have been a comma, he just puts a period and starts a new sentence. Like, he loves sentences. And I understand that. But the way that it flows, it kind of, it actually is realistic to what it would be like if I was a historian in a military mercenary band and I'm sitting there and I'm journaling. That's kind of the feel I get. So for me, it actually didn't disrupt me. It made me more immersed. And this is an example where you don't have to go overly flowery with prose to have a really distinct style. And it's so important to match style with the world. And this world is very matter of fact. This world is very dark. And the writing actually gets that across in a way for being so short. Now, what I will say is paragraphs are almost like individual vignettes or scenes. So you will jump time without ever really acknowledging the fact that there was a time jump. You just kind of have to figure it out. So you're kind of being thrown in the deep end, paragraph to paragraph, which some people feel is a bit jarring.
So it's like Jack Vance's Dying Earth.
Well, yeah, I understand why people would relate it to something like Dying Earth by Jack Vance, at least that first book. But it's not as pulpy as that. And I don't say that in a bad thing, because I think that pulpy fantasy is awesome. And what Jack Vance in Dying Earth was really, really awesome. But it's not quite to that level. I think it's a lot more congruent throughout the story. It's not like you're just being thrown in with random people and random scenes constantly and you have no footing. It still is, there's a sequence of events that are happening and you just happen to be jumping into the sequences that the chronicler, felt like he should be recording or had time to. So you kind of you got to be on the balls of your feet. You got to be on your tiptoes here. You got to be able to dive in and understand what's going on. But I didn't really have a problem with this. And even though I do see shades of, even like the Northmen from Joe Abercrombie's First Law series and obviously the Malazan Marines and all that stuff, I still feel like there's something unique to The Black Company by Glen Cook that has drawn me in. And that is some of the overtly wacky world building. There are flying carpets, there's massive leopards, and as I told you with the premise and the plot introduction, there's a lot of magic as well. And when you start seeing the lady and the limper and these 10, right, that have been taken, you start seeing them interact with these lowly soldiers. It makes for a really interesting dynamic because we're following the everyday Marine, the grunt. And then they're talking to these people who have been alive for, centuries and been in the Barrowland, and they are super powerful. But there's an interest on both sides. Croker is fascinated with the lady, but it also feels like the Taken are also kind of fascinated with them. So those scenes where those people are interjected and, I found them to be, I could not take my eyes away from the page. I was kind of glued to it, in fact. And the thing about the Taken that I love is that, this resistance that's trying to go against the lady and the Taken, they're very united. I think they're called the 18. I might be wrong about that, but they're banding together and it's very obvious what their goal is. But the Taken are fighting against the rebellion, but they're fighting against each other just as much. So the bad guys here, there's a lot of, you call them the bad guys, but there are times where you might root for one of them because they're going against one of the other Taken that you hate a little bit more. And the lady's motivations and not bringing back the Dominators. So a lot of the more morally complex stuff actually comes from the side of the bad guys, at least in my opinion. And then you have this mercenary, you have the Black Company that's just in the middle of it all. So it makes for a lot of dynamics that you would not normally get in an epic dark fantasy of this, this threat of this, pretty much overpowered force. The thing that they don't have is unity. And without unity, it's up in the air. It makes it a more competitive battle. And people are wondering where the White Rose might come from. So you have that question kind of lingering over these books. And I'll be honest, this is one of my top priorities to get through. I'm going to read every Black Company book from this point on, because if this is the worst that Glen Cook has to offer me in the Black Company, we're good to go. I'm going to eat this up. I don't have a problem with the writing. I don't have a problem with the characterization. I like military fantasy quite a bit, especially when it's down to this low of a level and it's this intimate. I think that he takes extreme care in the POVs, and I love a good chronicling tale. So I hope that kind of gives my perspective on the Black Company and what it does that, not even just for the 80s, but for now, makes it special. And I know that there are going to be people that drop down in the comments, and I encourage you to, saying, hey, this did not work for me. I didn't love it. So maybe this would give you an opportunity to revisit it at a time. Or maybe if you have been a little bit hesitant to jump into this older series because you have seen people bounce off of it, maybe this would change your mind, because I really, really like this book. And I think in 2023, The Black Company is up there with one of my top priorities to finish. And I've read a lot of fantasy series. I've gotten through most of the big named ones, right? This feels so exciting to find something that's a little bit older, that is very unique and still dark fantasy, which I tend to be drawn towards. And I have 10 books of it. Like, there's still things out there to discover and to enjoy. And it's interesting the fact that it's written a bit differently. It's interesting in the fact that it's not like other typical epic fantasies, but still feels really high fantasy and really epic. So that's awesome. If you found this review helpful, it'd be awesome if you could hit the like button. If you loved it, think about subscribing. I do all kinds of book content here on the channel. And if you really want to help out the channel, there is a Patreon in the description. It's optional, but always appreciated. Until I see you next time, be good, be safe, and remember to always keep turning the page. And a big thank you to all my patrons, especially my Kingsguard, which include Lauren, Henrik, Kai, Simon, Oscar Stewart, Stephen R., Akaika, Amanda, RJ Shaw, Nicoletta Tanner, Jennifer Garrick, Frank C., Evie Fever J., Sarah Pat, Kevin Ryan, Michael Terrence, Wade, Darren, Taylor D., Derry, John C., Boss Machin, Sebastian, Benjamin, Jobot, Noel, Amanda L., Kyle, C. Scott, Steve Talks Books, and Caitlin, and Dylan M. Thank you all so much. You're the best.